I tell a lot of the audiences that if you're going to participate in phenomena, particularly with UFOs, there's three things that you need to have or understand. First of all, there's a sense of humor, because I don't know if anybody watches this field, it is vicious that people just get ripped up. You're going to be attacked. I don't care what your position is, you're going to be attacked. And by the people who are proponents of UFOs. The skeptics are nothing. Second is you better have a day job or be rich, because nobody's making a lot of money at this, contrary to popular belief. And finally, the thing underneath is better understand conspiracy theory, because you're part of it. Either you believe, as 70% of the people in the US do, that the government is covering up UFOs, or if you don't believe that and say so, then you're part of the cover-up, so no win. Now, we'll start with the problem, and that is, how do you define a UFO? And part of the big issue is, on one end, you've got little balls of light, like you see there. On the other end, we're talking about hard craft that are more than a mile in diameter and whatnot. On the other end, we're talking about hard craft that are more than a mile in diameter and whatnot. And then everything in between. And that's part of the problem, is there are so many differences. So when you talk about a UFO, trying to define what you're talking about is really fairly difficult. Now, the question about ET and life in the universe, as far as I'm concerned, the probability of intelligent life somewhere in the universe is astronomically in favor, just as we're now learning more and more planets out there and things. We suspect that some of them must be in what we call the Goldilocks zone, meaning areas that could sustain life. So that's highly probable, except in Florida, where that's the Cayley case. Now, the spectrum of beliefs, and this is kind of where people vary quite a bit. On one end, down here, is what we have debunkers. They not only say it can't be, therefore it isn't, and whatnot, and they come out actively opposing any kind of concept of UFOs. And you got skeptics who are saying, I don't know, and probably don't care, but that's okay. The vast majority of the people are up there in UFOs exist. And that's probably true. Then you get off into crashes and retrieval. I've got a chapter in the book that addresses crashes. And I said, you know, if all the crashes happen that people report, what ET has is a quality control problem. Because they can go a gazillion miles and come here and fall down on a continuous basis. The next one is ARV, or the re-engineered vehicle, and some people think that that happened out at Area 51. We'll discuss that a bit and why I don't believe that. And finally, not only are aliens here, but they're living among us. And there was recently a global poll, and it came out and said 20% of the people in the world, not just the US, 20% of people in the world believe that ET is here living among us. So that doesn't mean weird little creepy crawlers. We're talking about people, and I guess some of you may be sitting in the audience here tonight, we just don't realize it. One of the things that I do address in some detail, when I was still a lieutenant colonel, we decided to put together a group to look at this whole issue of UFOs. And all the participants came from all the services, from the intelligence community, CIA, DIA, NSA, and aerospace industry. And everybody had to have a top secret and the special, what we call SCI level clearances. Old boy net, meaning we knew who everybody was. It wasn't just blanketing. And we decided to look at what was going on. One of the things I might mention is we made it FOIA. For FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, we were frankly afraid of it at the time, so we said no written records. Well, that's also the reason we called it the advanced theoretical physics problem. So we didn't think people would write in and say, give us all your documents on advanced theoretical physics, so we could stay legal. Now, what did we expect? This is what we thought was going on. Remember the Raiders of the Lost Ark? You see, at the end, you see them carting off the vehicle and parking and so forth. And we had heard all the tales that I think most of you are familiar with. And that's what we thought there was, that someplace somebody had stuff, or at least was studying it, and we could dig it out. The first line of my book, it was on the first slide, is UFOs are real. The last, and we'll get to it at the end, it says, and whatever this is far more complex than anything we ever anticipated. But the point is, you have multisensory data. You don't have to rely just on eyewitnesses or eyewitness testimony, even though some of that's really pretty good. You have a lot of highly competent witnesses. But basically every sensor system we have picks them up. And the point is, yes, we start out, 95% of the sightings have prosaic answers. We know that. Misidentification, weather phenomena, other natural kinds of phenomena, misidentification of planes, etc. But you end up with about 5%. And some of those, no matter what you do, come out with very, very difficult answers. You really can't define what it is. This is a case that happened, is best known for the events in late December of 1980. And there were multiple incidents. One of the things that happened, the thing had come down, landed outside the base, and this guy down, let me try something here. It does work. Jim Peniston had gone off the end of the base, and when I called up and talked to him, I said, I want to talk to you about the UFO. He says, oh, you mean the one I touched? He had actually walked up and put his hands on the object. What I like about the case is you've got lots of witnesses. What happened is after the first sighting, base was rumbling a little bit about what's going on. And they're having a Christmas party, and the provost marshal comes in and sees Chuck and says, they're back. He says, who's back? The UFOs are back. And they had something just like base. He goes, his famous last words, I'll take care of this. Probably wishes he'd never said that or had sent somebody else out. Because what they did is they went out there. He actually made a recording, came to light sometime later. But what he described basically is an object that moved through the woods between them. It eventually split into 5 parts, went shooting off, comes overhead, shoots a laser beam at their feet. Now, we do know that something very heavy landed there. There was indentations. They actually made plaster casts. And that there was actually radiation readings well above background. Point here is, this is one that comes with a lot of strong evidence supporting it. What's amazing to me is the press. And here are some of the examples. There was a thing in end of 2010, a press report came out, said, they had described kind of a pyramid-shaped thing. Maybe they dropped a dummy Apollo craft out there, and you go, we haven't lost any Apollo capsules out there. But nonetheless, they said, this best fits the description. They had said the same thing before, it's a burning hay wagon or something. But the point is that, the skeptics put out answers that don't fit the facts whatsoever. Press picks up on it and says, case complete. Not at all true. Phoenix Lights case is another good one. If you go through the example, you'll actually see there's a film clip that's on there that's pretty good. The point on the Phoenix Lights is it started here. The incident started here in Henderson, Nevada, is time synchronized down over Kingman to Prescott to Phoenix and all the way to Tucson. The official explanation that came out is A-10s drop flares. You go, I don't know of any flares you can drop here that will fly down there. The film They had a number of videotapes that had been, thousands of people saw this. Now, to his great discredit, the governor, Fife Symington, called in his thing, and he had a guy come in with an alien costume on, ho, 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 look at this silly stuff, what are these stupid people seeing? Later, it turns out, he had actually witnessed it. He came forth on Larry King and said, yeah, I saw this thing as well. He's also a pilot that has seen a lot of things in the air. The other thing is, if you go through here, Dr. Lynn Katai has done a lot of work in videotape. It's not a single incident. These have literally been taped for years. This is one of the really famous cases that again, very, very high credibility. What happened is you had a Huey helicopter that was returning. It was headed towards Mansfield, Ohio. There were 4 reservists. They'd been down taking a physical that day. They're flying along, and they see this red light sitting off to the side. Comes zipping at them, and they go into evasive movements. He puts the collective straight down, meaning this thing's supposed to be dropping like a rock, and with the collective all the way down, what happens is they get picked up. This thing hovers over them with a big green light and lifts the helicopter up, and then was released them. These are pictures of the object that they saw. Now, interestingly, as I said, you had 3 of the 4 people pretty on board pretty much confirmed this case. 1 did not, but you also had various witnesses on the ground confirming these things happening. By the way, interestingly, this became what's known as a hangar queen. After that, it was constantly down for repairs. This is an interesting case, particularly from a photographic perspective. When it was taken, this wasn't seen. They didn't take UFO. They're actually, she was taking a picture of the mountain, and lo and behold, there was a UFO there, and Dick Haynes in particular took a lot of background research on it. This is a case, September 71, that's kind of interesting because what's unique about this, you had a reconnaissance plane. It was doing on a mapping run. So it's from the top looking down. Usually you end up looking up at UFO photographs and you can't get perspective. Because of where this is, they could do it. This has been observed. Now, again, the people who took the photograph did not see the UFO. They were just taking the routine photographs at the time. And this was taken by the government in Costa Rica. This is a really phenomenal case. What happened is, you say it's 3:30 in the morning, 68, B-52 is out there and he gets called and they said, we'd like to vector you someplace, please go. And they said, well, what are we looking for? He says, you know, just go to this area and see what you find. As they're driving up, their radar sees a UFO coming up and picked up on them. In this case, the crew, which is here, they fly over this thing, which is basically on the ground. And we're talking, they described as an object that's hundreds of meters long, 200 feet in diameter, glowing yellow metal cylinder and all that. Now, in addition to the crew in the air looking down on it, there are people on the ground who are witnessing it all. So you're seeing it from multiple perspectives. Now, this was actually put into Blue Book. And the reason I say that this is a disgraceful analysis is that it must be a star or something out there that they had seen. And you go, just totally doesn't fit the facts at all. Again, you had you had the crew on board the B-52, as well as 16 other witnesses on the ground that saw this from various perspectives. Almost all those were Air Force. There's thousands of aviation pictures out there. There's a case here in southern Australia where they're talking to the guy who just disappears in mid-sentence. They never have found him. He's flying down towards Tasmania. A great case in Brazil. A pilot, a very experienced pilot, retired Brazilian Air Force pilot out there. All of a sudden he's surrounded. This goes on for 5 hours. They sent up various kinds of interceptors. One of the big things about this was that the air minister came in and said, you know, hey, this has happened. It's one of the first times where a senior aviation official came out and said, yea, verily, you know, the UFOs are here, we've seen them and whatnot. There was a flap over Belgium. This picture has recently been taken back. The guy said that they actually hoaxed it. But the point was that you had sightings that were going on for a period of months and huge triangles, thousands and thousands of witnesses seeing it, absolutely true. Now, what you hear a lot about is that people say, we'd like to have disclosure. And I argue this is not the greatest story never told. You had, starting with Truman coming forward and saying, you know, I can assure you the flying saucers are real. It's kind of interesting. This was, if you read the thing, it was on, 4 April 1950, which would have been day one of disclosure. American president saying, hey, this is real. So I went and looked and said, what's the news headlines the next day? It had to do with some trials that were going on. UFOs didn't even make the paper. And in that same time frame, you have General Nathan Twining, who's Chief of Staff of the Air Force, coming out saying, definitely, this phenomena is real. It's not visionary or fictitious. Reagan actually had a plane when he was governor, was flying along and chased a UFO. He had another sighting on the ground. And so he confirms that it's real. Gorbachev, the same way. Phenomena is definitely real. Lord Hill Norton is, if anybody in UFO circles know, he's made lots and lots of statements about the UFOs being real. General de Brouwer, he's a guy who, as a lieutenant colonel, was involved in that flap over Belgium, actually chased it around, had radar sightings and whatnot. But he went on to become the Deputy Chief of the Royal Air Force, says absolutely real. George Knapp, many of you know him, had met with General Meltzoff, who was the Chief of Staff, and he says, skeptics and believers, you know, UFOs are definitely real. His boss, Ivan Trekov, says the same thing. Now, these are really significant cases, and the reason I say that more than usual is that their predecessor had been fired, three-star general, was fired when a guy, a young German by the name of Rusk, flew in and landed near Red Square. So on one hand, you got the head of the Air Force being fired for allowing something in, a Cessna, and then the other guys, the successors, come out and say, we got UFOs flying around and that's okay. Duke of Edinburgh, the same kinds of statements, reliable witnesses. Hans Oberth is basically the head of modern space travel, same sort of thing. UFOs are definitely real. The Vatican comes up, Father Balducci, saying it's a good possibility, God's wisdom has no limits. So my point here is you got all of these guys, all say, I have Carter and I have different ones on him. He actually reported a UFO when he was the governor of Georgia. So all these guys are coming out and saying this is real. How many times you have to be told it's real before you go, yeah, okay, it's real. You've had disclosure by, all of these countries. And in the UFO mythology, one of the things that's going to happen, it's going to be sort of the end of the world. One of the things that did happen when the French put theirs out, they dumped all of their UFO sightings out one day, and the computer system crashed. There were so many people who were trying to get information on it. So when the Brits did it, that they did is split it up over years and just released a few cases at a time, and that went really pretty well. But all these other countries and others, Paraguay recently came out, who have said they have reports. But, like I said, what the main UFO said, the world is going to end, the world as we know it ends, and all of that. And what happened? It's been more like this. It's really been a huge ho-hum. So, so my point here is, one of the things you keep hearing is that this is going to change the paradigm. This changes everything. And you go, You know, confirmation of what you already believe is not a paradigm shift. It's interesting information. You know, therefore they're real. Does it change everything? No. Now, for the others are here. Remember, there's people who say that, you know, the ET must be among us. Well, if he did, he rode in with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and is definitely not for our benefit. If ET's here, like I say, you look at all the wars that are going on, certainly not helping in that domain. Poverty is epidemic and increasing. All these wonderful technologies are supposed to be coming. Don't see a lot of help there. These, by the way, are pictures that I've taken at various places around the world. And this is my compared to what, particularly when you get into the, why doesn't the military pick this up? There's a number, I know some of you in the back can't see it, but it's, you know, 15 trillion, 725 billion, et cetera, 833 million. This was the national debt at some time today. And I say sometime today because, you know, these things are literally spinning. You can go on the website and look at it. So this is what I talk about, is compared to, you know, the problems of war, economics, foreclosure, certainly well known here. Now, what about contact? And this is what I call, go through quickly, a gradient here. And it starts with signals or low-level life, confirmation of transient events, a high visibility encounter, and finally a hostile attack. And I say, let's just look at the perspective of all of those. The first one starts with small and far away. And the point here, of course, is you get weak signals. And if any of you remember the wow signal that was picked up, SETI actually did pick up a signal like that. And so what happens when you get that? Well, if you're lucky, you may get a news story or two for a couple of days. You get some conferences that'll talk about it. You may get some articles. If you had something that was vastly superior, we don't go in and try to communicate with ants and white mice or anything like that. So if somebody else was that advanced, would they come and talk to us? Now, moderate impact, and this is on a slow day. And again here, what you see is the kinds of sightings that I've been talking about. If you're lucky, you get on the news, you have some conferences. Larry King used to be pretty good. Basically, this is the status quo. So for unicellular life or signals from far away, sightings of UFOs, we know what that response is. Now, what about the day the Earth stood still? And here I argue that if this happens, i.e. you got some widget that's sitting out there, the cameras go in and they can look at it, you get a continuous basis. I think that the 9/11 model is the thing that you would get. Yeah, you stop the news for a few hours, you look at it. Remember, the TV stations are making money based on selling ads. So pretty soon you're breaking up for getting ads, and other stories go on. And within a short period of time, yep, you're kind of back to where you were. If you have the high visibility account, if you know anything about our distribution system for food, for energy, and things like that, we run primarily on just-in-time, meaning we count on supplies on a continuous flow. So if the people who bring your stuff to the grocery store aren't driving their trucks and things like that, this system collapses pretty quick. Now, what about the catastrophic encounter, i.e. ET is coming to eat us or whatever? You know, this notion that they're going to come and fight us mano a mano just makes absolutely no sense at all. And what I point here is if ET understands physics, they also understand biology. So if the issue is depopulation of the world, you know, you do it with a biological weapons attack. And the other thing, they also probably understand cloning. If you need the people for something, what you do is you raise your own. You know, people are kind of pesky and whatnot. So said, ET says no to free-range humans. Now, one of the problems that we have here, and I'll use this as an example, is, you know, the electromagnetic spectrum, what we see is in a very tiny band within that, and yet we tend to think that's reality. And the point here is when you look at the entire spectrum of possibility of events, particularly the movies, we end here disproportionately talking about we're going to meet ET because he needs us for some reason or another. Realize that we're one of 197 countries. We are only 4% of the global population, 6% of the land mass, 2% of the global surface. So ET is going to come from there to here, and he just happens to pick, the White House to land on. When I'm being really nasty, I say maybe they're going to pick a rising power like China, Brazil, or India. Religious issue came up. My wife did a study for Bob Bigelow here, and there was always this hypothesis that it changes everything about religion and is going to really upset everything. So she sent out surveys to 1,000 clergy. We got a very high response rate. Bottom line was they all responded and said, nah, no big deal. Jesuits were a little different. They said, more converts, people to work with. But it certainly ran against the conventional wisdom that's written about in what would happen to religion. Also, it's kind of interesting. It says we all, in the folklore, they say ET is highly spiritually evolved. Actually, if you look at what's happening here on Earth, that's kind of counterintuitive, because as we have get greater understanding in science and whatnot, it has certainly led to decrease in religious attendance and activities. We also say that one of the things I say is you want the government to study UFOs and ETs, and that would be a good thing. You say, but we have a host of other phenomena out there. You don't expect the government to be involved in that, so why do you want them to be involved here? Now, here's one of the big problems in discussion that goes on. This is a study that was done. This is belief in various phenomena, which you find this is probably a low figure, probably up closer to 80, 90% of the public actually believes in various kinds of phenomena. When they looked at all professors, it's well over 50% who are accepting of that. The American Academy, or the Academy of Aeronautics and Astronautics, we're down to 30%. This is the National Academy of Sciences. These are supposed to be our premier scientists, and it is down at 4%. So if you want to know why people and these senior scientists can't communicate, is that you're operating from very different belief systems. Now, one of the things we get asked about is ET. I'll talk just a little about that. The point is that there are reports of interactions between humans and sentient non-humans that go throughout human history, and that you don't have to have ET or whatnot to do that. And here are pictures that you see in even going back to cave art, angels, out-of-body experiences and whatnot. These kinds of interactions have been reported, and UFOs are a fairly new wrinkle on that. We have dealt with, these are shamans from various places in the world, and I can tell you they deal with the world very differently from the way we think about it. This is Pablo Maringo shortly before his death, using ayahuasca. Won't get into much detail on that, but the point is these guys are artists, and you see in the art, this is in the Peruvian Amazon. These are way out in the boonies. And yet UFOs are a common theme in the artwork that's found there. Now, there have been interactions between UFOs, armed interactions. Now Lieutenant General, Lieutenant Parvez was sent out. A UFO is seen over Tehran. It's actually out in the desert out there. You have it by ground radar from various visual sightings. They vector in 2 aircraft. What was interesting, this is in the days of the Shah, as they flew in, all of a sudden the electronics were turned off. He gets ordered to fire. As he got active and said he was getting ready to fire, all of a sudden it shut down. Another one here, it's in Peru. Again, the same thing. This thing was seen flying around for a couple of hours, sent him out there. He actually fired 30 millimeter rounds, something about, that big, and it said to sort of went and just absorbed them, and then the whole thing went shooting out, but did absolutely no damage at all. There's interesting cases of missiles. This was at Malmstrom Air Force Base in '67. And what happened is you had 2 sites. that went down. I've interviewed all the people who were involved at the at Oscar site, which was really quite interesting. And the point here is they've got the ground crew who's up above calling down and saying, got a UFO down here, or out here, we're really worried about it. And as they got to working on it, all of a sudden their missiles started going down one after another. So they called back to SAC headquarters to tell them, hey, this is going down, so they haven't got time to talk to you because November site is already down 10 for 10. So you got something that's screwing with the strategic triad here. This is a major event. You would normally expect 2 missiles to go down for the entire fleet in a year, and you've got, you know, at least 16 down simultaneously. Now, the point here is, if there were even the slightest possibility that you were going to bump into ET out there, you think they would have had, you know, some kind of contingency plans. I will tell you that there absolutely wasn't. Now, this is not because they didn't think of it. And Helen Kupperman was a friend of mine. I worked with her husband, Bob, who was the head of FEMA at one point. And the point is that NASA actually had protocols for what happens if you bump into ET. And by the way, there are treaties that are out there that calls for instantaneous release of the information on a worldwide basis. So the point is, if you had no contingency plans whatsoever, and everybody agrees on that. Phil Corso wrote one of the most popular UFO books that's been out in certainly recent decades, and it was called Day After Roswell. And we knew about Phil before the book came out. In fact, George Knapp was supposed to be his co-author, and it ended up being Bill Burns. I spent a lot of time actually in Washington checking his background. He was who he said he was there, and absolutely none of the technology claims are real. I had done work, and I knew personally the director of Night Vision Lab, because one of the things that's in the book is that they had take alien eyeballs out, and that was the technique that had given us our big leap in night vision. I think what most of the people don't understand is how large institutions work. And the point here is institutions work to serve themselves. And contrary to popular belief, there is no Department of Good Ideas, okay? Every institution in the government has roles, responsibility, things that they do. What's kind of interesting is people seem to forget that when Apollo 11 and 12 went up, when they returned, the first 2 that actually had lunar landing, the people went into isolation. And what we were worried about there was, you know, introduction of foreign microbes that might have carried disease. Yet on the other hand, we're supposed to believe that, hey, ET is alive and well, and we're going to allow them to walk up and shake hands. Hoaxes are a real problem, and they're not benign. I mean, you talk to the hoaxer, and it's, it's funny. This is kind of, this is e-skeptics put out, said this was a social experiment. This is one over New Jersey. The government does have secrets. Many of you know the MJ-12 stories and all of that. Yep, they've had stories. And the point with all of these is they all became known, and none of them were dropped in a mailbox, if you know that thing. Now, you also hear about unacknowledged special access programs, a lot of misunderstanding. There are such things, but it doesn't mean nobody knows. What it means is we don't acknowledge them to the public as the areas that we're working on. And no, there aren't any, you know, huge black budgets that have no oversight. I mean, the folklore goes that there are folks out there with just buckets of money that just go and keep dumping it out there. The reality is, if anybody's worked in the black world, the competition for funding in that area is just as fierce as it is in the white world. Here's a classic example. Kelly Johnson is the guy who started Area 51. He's the guy who identified it. In the folklore, because he did have a UFO sighting, and he actually drew it up, and they said, the SR-71 is based on his UFO sighting. We say, well, this is what he drew, and that's what an SR-71 looks like. So, no, it's not what's true. So nope, there aren't any big back programs out there. One of the things I point out with NASA, At the time that we were going to the moon, it was 4.4% of the budget. Right now, we're down at 0.6%. We have decided to give up on that. Some of you here will know Bob Bigelow. There's an individual from here in Las Vegas who actually has personally has two satellites in orbit here now. That's actually a picture that they gave of where they're going. But the point here is that we're moving heavily towards civilization of space, and we're ceding it to China. They're going to Mars, by the way. Their plans are well underway. This was an article that I reviewed for a scientific journal recently that was talking about, actually heard him present on it, that not only is there life on Mars, there's a base on Mars, and this is a pipe, and that's a spray that's going out there. And part of it was there are unregistered flights out of Cape Canaveral all the time. Here's some of the things that are proof. You can actually find these pictures on the internet. Of course, you're probably familiar with a face on Mars. Most recently, there was one that had a building that was supposedly there. Here's a picture of hominids and trees. Very recently, this is one where, this was in the last couple of weeks, where you had a sighting on the sun and an object was picked up there. Basically, it's a cosmic ray that hits, and they say, we're hiding the UFOs flying there. Local folklore, if you know John Lear, God love him, that's me and John and whatnot. But he came out and said, we didn't go to the moon. Anybody with a computer knows we didn't go to the moon, and a whole series of these things. By the way, if you've been threatened, this is a crime. Again, report it. This is the letter that Steve Bassett wrote. Said, quote, this is 11, not uncommon for military intelligence, to warn people they've been killed. Sorry, that's a crime. A change in or acknowledgement of what you already believe is not a paradigm shift. It's interesting information. I kind of take on what I call the true believers and debunkers on both ends. Now, neither of them will listen to reason. And if you don't believe everything, hook, line, and sinker about the suppositions they put out, you become the enemy. So concluding, UFOs are a global phenomenon. This is not something that's just happening here. The reality, in my view, beyond all reasonable doubt, that you've got something that's going on that's that massive amounts of evidence point towards that. Despite that, reality is rejected by most scientists. So the evidence that you will accept, they generally will not, nor will they look. They won't even bother to look at it. And again, this gets back to the Condon report. We already answered that. Do have an agenda. What I'd like to do is to make it permissible for scientists to get actively involved in the field without personal ridicule. And the final words in the book is, in the end, it is clear the universe is far more complex than we ever imagined. We are not close to solving the problem, and I keep getting pressure on what is the answer of these enigmas that are posed. Rather, we're on the front end of defining the issues. And that's what I think we need to do. We need to get in there and define. Now, if everybody will look up here,